are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
So the person actually wrote one of the famous emails that we as pastors get and accused me of making this political statement that had some racial undertones and those type of things, and actually threatened to the next time, said he thought about charging the stage.
Oh, my goodness.
He actually thought about, confronting me while we were, even after the service. So Rich looks at that and he says, okay, hey, I've read through Charles's transcript. There was nothing in there that was like that. Really came to my defense, in that moment via email. And quite ironically, it was probably years later that same individual came up to me and said, I thought about it. And I got that email and I really prayed about it. And no, you really weren't saying anything, with racial undertone. And I've had a chance to listen to you, over the last 2 years and since, and that's even not your heart. And so I want to come to you and I want to apologize. This is someone that, is a white sibling. This is someone who probably has a different worldview in many arenas.
Right.
Than I did. But again, in terms of the whole notion of solidarity, I really felt from another pastor, there was someone coming alongside of me and being able to say, you know what, because you're trying to walk this out, not that you're perfect in that sense, but because you're trying to walk this out, I'm standing behind you as a pastor, as a black pastor.
Yes.
And I really felt that I had a home in the Vineyard because of those two moments.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. As we celebrate Black History Month, in today's episode, our host, Jay Pathak, is going to talk again with Dr. Charles Montgomery Jr. Charles is the association's strategic coordinator for Vineyard USA, serving historically underrepresented groups in the Vineyard. Let's listen in.
Well, Charles, thanks for joining me again.
It's a privilege to be here, brother.
Last time you were joking with me a minute ago. We were sitting in a basement with noise all around us. I have no idea how Casey managed to filter it down. It was like music and choir and
choir rehearsal. I'm so happy that Casey uses his powers for good in that sense. But this is certainly a much better setting than we're in on today.
It is. Yeah. Well, we're in snowy Denver right now. And if you didn't hear the last podcast with Charles, I would highly recommend you listen to it, because today we're just going to sort of build off of that. Like most of the time I just ask for stories and, how did you get to be here? And this person, I'm assuming that everybody listening has listened to that. So they've got to hear. They got to hear your story. Of course, it'll show up again, but we're not going to re-rack the whole thing and do some other thing. I would rather just build on it, because we're in Black History Month. And so as the Vineyard, we're wanting to focus and pay attention. And I guess I would just like to ask you, like, why is there a Black History Month? And how did that start? How'd that form? Tell us a bit about.
Carter G. Woodson really started in the. It's funny you have to say now the 20th century, which is really impressive.
Man, I'm old.
Right, it's really something. But Carter G. Woodson actually wanted to create a Negro History Week. Now I want to say it's like 1920, 1930. I might be a little bit off right there, but he wanted to create a Negro History Week. And what he began to look at, particularly, was in our educational system in America when we were looking at what history was, American history, what some of the he didn't see Black culture. That was reflected in our school system and our educational system. And he said we should have a week in that sense in which we are focused on Black History Week. And I believe, if my memory serves me correct, it was somewhere around the second or third week of February. And it was done for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, because it was right around the birthday of Abraham Lincoln and also Frederick Douglass. And so it was like, let's do this and let's do a Black History Week. And so I think that there were a lot of hits with that. And I think, ironically, it was right around 1970 or so in which, of all places in the great state of Ohio, Kent State University, there was actually a push to actually create Black History Month, again, to amplify voices, to amplify that part of our American history, and it kind of took off from there.
That's interesting. And I'm sure, you gave 2 dates there, 20s or 30s, 1970. There's 40 years, 50 years in between.
Yeah, if my math was correct. I could be off.
Something in there. But obviously, that little window, I'm sure, was full of any number of conflicts around, is this valid for us to do?
Yes.
Is this somehow demonstrating some kind of preference that we shouldn't demonstrate? And or, why would we even need to do this?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
Which inherently demonstrates the problem in and of itself.
Right.
But say more about that. I mean, when you look at that kind of and of course we have the incredible movement, the civil rights movement,
sure,
through that same window. Say a little bit about how, because a lot of our pastors and leaders would be listening to this going, I really want to give emphasis. I know we need to pay attention here, but
sure,
sort of the pushback is really, why are we emphasizing this? There's a million things we could pay attention to. Isn't that just sort of a cultural thing? Why in the Vineyard would we pay attention to something like this in this window? Isn't that sort of artificial?
Sure. That's a really good. In terms of reflecting on that, Jay, I think of a few things. First and foremost, it is a part of our history.
Yes.
It is a part of our shared history. So it's not just, history for people who are twice kissed by the sun. In that sense, it is our shared history, which really kind of opens the door, not just in terms of it transcends Black folk, but really beginning, especially when you look at civil rights movement and you look at how things have evolved. I look at the aspect of what about our white siblings, other ethnicities that came alongside and began to look at issues of oppression and injustice, and came alongside and began to look at, from abolitionists to allies in the civil rights movement. And when you begin to connect that to some of the things we're facing today, understanding the history that there were other people, it was a mosaic of people that came together to really look at issues of justice and oppression. And so if I'm a pastor and I want to see where we've come from as a country, in terms of Christianity, I think that's super important. I think it's also important as well because one of the questions I get from pastors oftentimes is, how do I connect with other ethnicities in my community? Well, you all of a sudden beginning to lift this up, really begin to show that you care about that part of the body, but then also not just caring about that part of the body, but also beginning to say, how do I connect with other people in my community, that is, whether it was in my church or beyond my church. So I think it's really a tangible way and a really critical moment to not just recognize, but also see how you move that to actionable change.
So I know you, Gino, different association leaders, you've been thinking through, how do we provide the right kinds of resources? If I'm a Vineyard pastor saying, hey, I'm on team. I want to play. I want to be a part of helping amplify voices, enable folks in our churches to get a sense of how our history works and how that relates to the kingdom of God. Like, God cares about these things. But honestly, Charles, I don't really know what to do. Like, I wasn't in a church that was multiracial or multicultural. I didn't grow up in that kind of church. We have not historically led that kind of church. But man, as I've heard you speak, or maybe as I've read some different things, or even as I've been in some of the Vineyard contexts, I'm buying. I want in. I want to see this different within my own life. I'm trying to think about how to lead differently. What are some of the resources or frameworks? What are things that you're thinking about, you're putting in front of folks to go, Vineyard pastor, Vineyard leader, here's some ways we want to give you some tools. We want to give you some frameworks. What are some of the things you're thinking about to help pastors?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jay. As I reflect upon that, even in listening to you, I think it's going to be really important. And I just had a conversation with Nicole Deal, that's working with our communications team, and one of the things a couple of things we want to put out in February in the Black History Month are actually theologians, Black theologians, and different books to help to expand our minds theologically for two reasons. Number one, again, being able to see this as a part of our history. And a lot of times people may not know the names, not beyond Howard Thurman, but know Dwight McKissick and James Cone and Will Gaffney and Katie Cannon, being able to see who are these people, what was their contribution to, or even going beyond that, Augustine, Tertullian, the father of Western Christianity and thought or whatever, being able to see those things and being able to say, you know what, I want to read these things to help expand my own my own repertoire. So that's one piece right there. I think it's also going to be important, especially as we've taken a run with these associations now with the first year. We are always coming into contact with some really amazing people, in the Vineyard. And so we want to feature, people, beyond the Charles Montgomerys, the Gene Olsons, the Josh Williams, those type of pieces. We have some amazing people in the Vineyard. So being able to amplify their voices, to spotlight them, being able to ask them questions, so we can get to know people in the Vineyard movement. It's going to be something. It's going to be really great. And then also we're just really having just kind of not so much a war chest, but just some practical tools that you might be able to, as a pastor, be able to access to say, these are some things I want to download on Sundays in my congregation to raise the level of awareness. So those are some of the things I'm thinking of, and hopefully we'll be able to produce in post-haste.
Yeah, so it's trying to get people to maybe understand history differently than they have, or not because they've tried to think differently, they just haven't been sort of included in that conversation, or they haven't sought that out. I mean, I love that you brought up Augustine or Tertullian. It's interesting even in this sort of Western theological tradition, how people don't realize these are Africans.
Yeah, African theologians.
I think people just, when they get old enough, it's like, I don't know where those guys are. They're dead old guys that have icons, but those are Africans. And that stuff, their thinking is influenced accordingly, and so there's a great tradition there, and I love the thought of amplifying voices. So, when you think about, okay, we're going to try to educate leaders, we're going to try to help them to lead differently. Where are the obstacles? Like, okay, well, why can't we get from here to there? What is a leader? What's in the way? Because again, you paint the picture of the Revelation picture, and that's the ultimate destination. We know this. This is in the Bible. Then you have wherever we are now. That doesn't look like that picture. In the Vineyard, in the body of Christ in America, most segregated hour in America, Sunday morning. Okay, so we know those two realities. What are the obstacles? So we're taking on one. Maybe people aren't informed. They don't have thoughts. We're not included within sort of a theological tradition. What are the other obstacles you're aware of that we're trying to help leaders navigate, jump over, bust through, lead their people through, pray our way through?
Yes.
Where are those obstacles? What are other obstacles you're aware of that leaders should at least have their eyes on?
Well, I think we have to always continually look at the polarization, not just in our country, but in our churches. And a lot of times that polarization, in that sense, is caused by fear, that we don't know one another, really.
Yeah.
So, a lot of times people talk to me about our 2015 message at the Global Conference. And one of the first things I talked about was the step one is personal proximity.
Yeah.
Getting in the same room together. And I think we're doing that. We're moving the ball down the field, with that. But are we really having conversations in terms of really, how is this connecting to the Bible? How do you see the Bible? How are we living that out? How are we really having the honest conversations? And I think a lot of that is generated by fear. I don't know what to say. I don't want to.
I don't want to offend.
I don't want to offend. I don't want to go on the landmine, those type of things, if you will. And we've got to move beyond, this whole notion of polarization into real relationship. That's one of the things we're looking at doing on our national team, leading out with that.
Yep.
We'll be moving through a 6-week series in which we're talking about racial righteousness and justice, in which we're kind of peeling the onion, or what was it? Peeling the onion.
Yeah, peeling the onion. Getting through the layers, right?
Getting through the layers, and really, in the same, really talking about, I always thought this, I always thought that.
Yes.
Having these levels of, we're doing this as a national team, but we want to move this toward our regional leaders, our area leaders, our pastors as well, to equip and empower people to do that. So as we're having that conversation, and in those honest conversations, we're creating space for the Holy Spirit to begin to move in such a way that we can move towards actionable change.
And Charles, I don't think there's anybody listening, if you're in the U.S. right now, that would disagree with the polarization thought, right? How it gets so stereotyped. Like, well, I know what you think. You're already filling in the blanks. Some of the buzzwords, the code words, like if you use this word, use this phrase, oh, I know who you are now. You're over there. In almost every media outlet, nearly every public conversation reinforces that reality. As far as I'm aware, there's very little, if any, encouragement to jump over those barriers, to question that stereotyping in all directions. So the hard work of walking across the room, so to speak, paying attention to like who are people that I can have this conversation with, even the things you're describing, like I've heard people say, or somebody has said this to me. What do you think about that? Is that an accurate reflection of what you think? And then just all the anxiety and the fear and the sort of cancel culture of, if one word's out of place, that could end me. Like I'm going to be offended and cut off, and or the other side, like the sort of sloppy, I'm just going to shoot off at the mouth. We have become so separated. I don't know of an institution that can do the work of building those bridges outside of the church. I'm looking around going, who has the sort of moral compass? Who has the grace on tap? If we believe the gospel tells us there's nothing you can do to make God love you more. There's nothing you can do to make him love you less. No matter what you've done, it can be dealt with. And what you're going to do and are doing can be covered by the grace of God, the blood of Christ.
Yes.
The cross of Jesus Christ stands between us and every enmity and division that we have with God and with others. If that's true, which I think it is, by the way, that should enable us to have latitude, the ability to be entirely honest, full of truth, full of grace. And it's the thing you just described. I think leaders lead. To the degree that leaders experience the changes that we're describing, their churches have the capacity to change. There's certain kinds of things leaders can't outsource. You can't say, I don't know if I can really do that work. There's this group of folks in our church who would like to try that. Sure, you should, run a class or, do a thing with another church in town. That's cool. You should do that. Have a prayer meeting or go to the forum that I guess somebody's putting on somewhere in our city about racial reconciliation. It will bump up against leadership. If our Vineyard leaders and pastors aren't saying, this is part of my work. Yes. This is part of my work. I have to decide that I'm going to go across the table. I'm going to create a table. People are going to be in my home. I'm going to be in people's homes. I'm going to embody the story of our city, understand some of the racial divides. Why do all the Spanish-speaking immigrants live in that part of town? I wonder why. Well, there's a story. 100% of the time, there's a story. It's not random. They didn't just happen to buy houses there. Why is there such a strong Asian population in this little part of town? Huh, that's weird. Why are all the black folks on that side of the tracks and one on this side of the tracks? There's a story. There's always a story. Usually the people that carry that story are the folks on the margins.
Precisely.
They're ready to, I mean, they can tell you the story. Actually, almost anybody can tell you, you know, if you just walk around that community and you're genuinely curious. Tell me about how did this happen? Or what does this mean? And I'm always encouraging pastors to get to know who are the ethnic minority marginalized pastors in your town.
Yes.
And go, and if you can do it, go and have lunch where they have lunch. Go and have dinner where they have dinner. And just hear the stories. Use the pastoral gifts you have. If you're a pastor, you've probably learned some tools, at least I hope you have, to listen, to care, to empathize, to pray with people. To do that work, just be a pastor with a pastor and listen and learn. What happens in that exchange is you get caught. Something happens on the inside of you where you go, man, there's an injustice here in this story. There's a hurt that's usually kind of present. And do all that before you think about some kind of plan. Like, I like plans, don't get me wrong, but when you have a plan that's motivated out of a relationship and a connection to a story and a person and a place, the odds of that plan doing well go way up.
Absolutely.
I mean, like, way up. Actually, you could not have a plan, and you'll probably do better than if you had a plan if you're connected to a person.
Amen. Amen.
But that takes a little intentionality. You got to, like, do a little work, and you have to know a little bit about your city, and then you have to be able to make those calls, make those connections. My confidence that Vineyard pastors then will be able to take the tools that you're describing, put them into play, is really high if they've made those personal connections. If they've been curious, they've prayed with another pastor, they've maybe had a meal in their home and invited them into their own home. My experience, maybe I'm wrong, to what you're describing a moment ago, is the kinds of conversations you need to have don't happen in the first 5 times you build a friendship. You might touch them a little. You might touch the hot part. But man, you're I don't know, 8 to 10 to 15.
It takes major reps.
It takes reps. And it takes genuine heart-to-heart connection, where you start to say, so tell me your story with this. Like how and even in our relationship, how do you feel about this? Like, what did you think when I first called you? Was it like, man, I can't wait to talk to that guy? Or is it like, oh man, there's another one of these guys? You know, like how did that work? And how's this working? Those kinds of things take, just like it does in most relationships, frankly, you know, it's not going to happen the first 5. Sometimes an exceptional leader, I mean, if they've covered that ground with people a bunch of times, they're ready. They're like, yeah, I'm ready to have this conversation with you. But even that, it can be awkward because people can feel a bit like projects, or, you know, you read a book or something, and now we're having this meeting. That feels awkward to me. So that takes a little bit of time to work through. So Charles, when you think about Vineyard pastors taking on this kind of work, the relationships we're asking them to form, the heart that we're asking them to sort of embody, you think about the associations we're building, you have a story that wouldn't be that different. I mean, here you are in the Vineyard. I doubt anyone that was from your family story or the church you grew up in would have foreseen what you're doing now.
They tell me that till this day.
It comes up from time to time.
From time to time. Very interesting Thanksgiving dinners. So, no, just playing.
No, I would assume so. I mean, so give me, if you have even a story or two or a moment or two where you saw someone cross the divide for you. where you went, you know what? I think this feels real. You know, even as you've been in this role, you're going around, you're talking, you meet with people. I'm sure there's any number of awkward exchanges. I mean, if we just wanted to do a bloopers podcast.
They do exist.
I just said, tell me the 10 weirdest, most awkward, awful moments. I'm sure we could do a good long segment. Well, you're a very honorable person. You wouldn't do it. I'd have to work really hard to get you to do it. But if I gave you truth serum and
right, then all of a sudden, nevertheless,
it just coming out.
It just comes out.
But you would not do that because you're not that man. But on the opposite, give me a couple where you're like, man, even from the Columbus Vineyard, or where you saw a breakthrough, where either you reached across and you saw that heart-to-heart connection where somebody, man, this is my brother, this is my sister. There was enmity. There was a thing that had to be shifted, and it turned.
Wow, there's so many of those.
Great. That's a good sign.
Yeah,
I was concerned you'd be like, well, there was this one time that.
It's interesting because oftentimes it's in the crucible of crises that character is revealed. And I can think of a couple of instances. One, in terms of a really great learning moment for me as a minister, but then also a personal, story in that sense. When I was engaged in ministry, first and foremost, right around Ferguson and Michael Brown, and we were really the nation's in uproar, and we're looking at what is a kingdom winsome, approach to dealing with the situation. And so we're talking about this as a team. And of course, there's a lot of emotions coming up inside of me, as well as many African Americans, blacks in the congregation in particular. And it was interesting as I was talking to the founding pastor, Rich Nathan, obviously that most people on this podcast would know. And Rich says to me, he says, well, I was reading and I found out there was a black pastor that was in Ferguson, Missouri, and his church was burned down. And I'd like to connect with an African-American pastor in our community. Bishop Tim Clark was his name, First Church of God, and they're really good friends.
He's the man,
He's the man. And so they'd already formed a relationship. They went through all these different reps that we're talking about earlier in the podcast. And they came together in that moment, and they brought this pastor from the St. Louis area to Columbus.
Wow.
And they said, we'd like to hear your story. And they connected with several pastors in the city. And we all came in and we heard this gentleman's story. And he talked about being on the front line in Ferguson, Missouri, how he was trying to operate, as a kingdom-minded Christian, and the effects of that church structure, the building being burned down. And as a result of that story, it pricked the hearts of so many pastors in that setting that we actually took up a collection to help to build back that church building. And it was all about, if one of us, was somewhere in our church was burned down, we're a small church and those type of things, what would be a kingdom response? What would Jesus do in that situation or scenario? How would Jesus show up?
Yeah.
And Rich was sharing with me at that point, Charles, this is the way in which we have to look at some of the things that are caused by racial divide. How do we show up as kingdom-minded citizens? And so we ended up, and we had a service later on at First Church of God, which was a predominantly black church in the area, and that was great. But it began to prick my conscience when I began to say, how do we show up as a vineyard? How do we show up as kingdom-minded people in the midst of so much happening in our community, in our world? So that's one story. The other story was actually I was preaching there at Vineyard Columbus, and I remember in the sermon I said, I said one thing in the sermon, and later on, like 15 minutes later, I said something else, and somebody in the audience tried to put these two things together and create a narrative that was saying that I was making a political statement that they did not necessarily. It just wasn't their jam. I'll put it that way.
Right.
And so they
imagine that.
Imagine
a
that
preacher says
a preacher says some things
somebody
whatever.
doesn't agree with.
and again, so I looked at Rich Nathan again and how he. So the person actually wrote into Vineyard one of the famous emails that we as pastors get.
Yeah.
And accused me of making this political statement that had some racial undertones and those type of things, and actually threatened to the next time said he thought about charging the stage.
Oh my goodness!
He actually thought about confronting me.
Mercy.
While we were even after the service. So Rich looks at that and he says, "Okay, hey, I've read through Charles's transcript. There was nothing in there that was like that." Really came to my defense.
Wow.
In that moment via email, and quite ironically, Jay, it was probably years later that same individual came up to me and said, I thought about it. And I got that email and I really prayed about it. And no, you really weren't saying anything, with racial undertone. And I've had a chance to listen to you, over the last 2 years and saying, that's even not your heart. And so I want to come to you and I want to apologize. This is someone that, is a white sibling. This is someone who probably has a different worldview in many arenas.
Right.
That I did. But again, in terms of the whole notion of solidarity,
Yeah.
I really felt from another pastor, there was someone coming alongside of me and being able to say, you know what, because you're trying to walk this out, not that you're perfect in that sense, but because you're trying to walk this out, I'm standing behind you as a pastor, as a black pastor.
Yes.
And I really felt that I had a home in the vineyard because
That's
of those 2 moments.
good. Yeah, so I'm going to stand with you. It's also interesting, like, the reason that second story is so good is because it's so rare. I mean, if you think about the amount of times somebody says, you said this wrong, or that's ridiculous, or that was politically motivated, when you didn't say that. I mean, sometimes people are upset and you meant to say what you said. And it's like, yeah, well, I meant to say that. But you're right. That's almost like a miracle unheard of. That
Yes.
Years later, first of all, they're still around. Second, that they've seen change. Third, that they'd come and talk to you. I mean, because I've discovered sometimes people have made changes way before, including you. Those little gifts are very rare
Yes,
as
sir.
pastors. I mean, in the last few years, I've had a few folks come up and go, 10 years ago this happened, and I never told you. And that changed for me. I should have come back to you. And I'm like, oh man, what a gift. Because there's often more fruit than we can see. It's beyond our vision. It's nice when somebody shows up with it and goes, hey, this fruit that's here from 10 years ago, what a gift. And Rich's intentionality, both of those stories are him trying to stretch one layer further. I mean, but what really strikes me is if he hasn't formed the relationship with Bishop Clark, he can probably still attempt the thing he attempted. He could call that pastor in St. Louis and say, hey, is there something we can do? It's probably not going to go the same way, partly because having Bishop Clark helps. And Rich probably wouldn't have had the same kind of skills or reputation that he'd learned probably through those other relationships.
Precisely.
And some of these things they're sort of soft, intuitive skills, cultural competency, the ability to fluidly move within different contexts, understand how another person thinks and talks, what might offend versus what speaks encouragement. Those are interesting skills that you develop through interaction. Those aren't the kinds of things you learn in a class. Like, it's sort of like learning to swim on the shore. There's only so much swimming you can learn on the shore.
Right, precisely.
Somewhere in here, we got to put your body in the water. We're going to teach a few things, but you got to get in the water with somebody standing next to you so you don't sink. We're gonna have to get your body moving through the water so you can feel what it feels like. This kind of work requires that. I think.
And it requires courage as well. Even as we're talking to pastors and leaders, throughout the Vineyard and beyond, in this particular podcast, there will be moments.
Yeah.
There will be inflection moments that will come up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing, as you said, to be on the shore or hear about some things theoretically,
Yep.
or to be able to believe what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5,
Mm-hmm.
I'm giving you, the God has reconciled us to God's self, and I'm giving you the ministry of
Yep.
reconciliation. But there comes moments in which you have to have both Christ's love, but you also have to have the courage to stand up in those inflection moments. You may not, as we know, we live between the already and the not yet. You may not see the fruit right away.
Yeah.
But again, these stories I'm talking about are 5 years, 10 years old, and those type of things, if you will. But it still makes an impression upon me. And and remember, you said, Charles, what were the things that made you feel like, okay, I'm in. I feel like I'm sewn in, that this is my tribe, all the things that we share in that sense. It comes down to those inflection moments. And so even as pastors and leaders are listening on today, when those inflection moments come and those crisis moments come, and then that the crucible of crises is going to reveal your character. We hope it's a Christian, kingdom-minded character.
Yes.
To the extent where it's going to make a major difference.
Yes. Yeah, and what I appreciate about you, Charles, is in every conversation like this I'm in with you, you locate the motivation, the inspiration, the power for this kind of work in the kingdom, in the cross, in the story of the Bible, in the history of God's church. You always locate there, which I really appreciate, because I find pastors sometimes get derailed when in the conversation it's located maybe in language and motivation that they can't see as readily as being the cross, the Bible, the kingdom, the history of the church. That it starts to kind of feel, whether it's true or not, it feels like it's grounded in a framework that isn't necessarily the kingdom. And I guess I would also want to encourage our advocates that when you're advocating or you're allied or you're speaking up with specifically your pastors, as much as you possibly can, locate this impulse, this inspiration, this desire, this drive within the story of the Bible.
Yes.
Within the theological convictions we have about the kingdom, the cross, the resurrection, the hope of reconciliation and forgiveness. Those are Bible words that aren't just words, they're full of power.
Yes.
They're endued with the power of the Spirit. When we begin to borrow language and motivation and inspiration, though it might also be biblical in thought, but we're not using biblical power sources.
Talk, sir.
You're really going to confuse the folks that might actually be willing to advocate. They might be willing to, but there's again, the polarization is working against us here. There's a nervousness I experience in pastors when the language isn't necessarily biblical. And I mean, I'm telling you, man, the wealth of resource within the story of the Black church, I mean, the breadth of learning that every pastor can take in from the story of the Black church and the way the Black church works in America, it is like this wealth of resource of health and healing and hope and faith, courage, that is just in just the depth of thinking. I mean, like the things you're describing, the wealth, the treasures that many, specifically pastors in the Vineyard, have never really even, opened the door to this library of health and hope. I mean, it's robust. So we don't have to go and try to raid a cultural story. We're not just joining the classic, maybe even a Marxist social story. We got a Bible story that tells us about Exodus and freedom. We have a Bible story that talks about racial reconciliation. We have a history in the Black church in America. I mean, the civil rights movement is so wed to the story of the Black church.
Absolutely.
That, it's really a travesty that so many people, even in the sort of non-Christian world, have somehow forgotten or gapped or unaware of its pastors driving the agenda out of a conviction by the power of the Spirit and by the story of the Scriptures. So I guess I just want to emphasize that, because when I'm in rooms with white pastors, some of the flinch, the nervousness is, well, isn't this sort of a social agenda? Isn't this sort of a politically left-motivated agenda? No, this is a Bible story.
It's a biblical story.
Period. This is a church history story in America, let alone from Jesus to today. And so when you're starting to entertain these conversations, you're starting to ask these questions, look at the resources we're trying to offer you. Look at what theologians are saying. Read the history of the Black church. And there's so much in the sort of way that they've operated in reconciliation, in the power of the Spirit. Specifically, our Vineyard story aligns so beautifully with this understanding of how God speaks, and God gives power, and God gives authority. We're not asking you to jump into some completely foreign world. We're asking you to expand how you understand the story of the Scriptures, the ministry of the Spirit, and then the ministry of the reconciliation accordingly. So I am beyond grateful for your leadership, Charles. I say it every time I'm with you. Just yesterday, we're in a meeting, and your contribution to say, I'm not sure we're not thinking in a way that we're hearing all the voices we need to hear here, was just so gracious and timely. Your contributions in every room you're in, that I'm in, are so valuable. And I am so excited about the work I'm seeing with associations. I think by and large, the people listening to us are saying, I want to play. Give me some tools. And so hopefully you got some out of this. In the show notes, we'll put some things for you to look at, some ways for you to move forward. But I guess the last I'd want to advocate for one more thing before we close up, which is, if you're listening to me, this is a spiritual war.
Yes, sir.
Please pray. Pray for Charles. Pray for me. Pray for our associations. When you see any of the association leaders, you see Charles, for you to even just say, how can I be praying for you? Or here's a word I feel like God gave me to encourage you. This is hard work, and every demon in hell wants to resist this kind of work. Please, please pray, please, please pray, and pass on the words of encouragement to my brother, Charles, to Gino, to all of the association leaders when you see them, because this will be won by the power of the Spirit, not by our intelligence or our wisdom, but by His grace. So, Charles, I want to thank you for making time to talk to me. Thanks so much. Again, we do cover your prayers, and we certainly wed ourselves to the conviction that the effectual fervent prayers of the righteous availeth very much. Amen. So thanks so much for your prayers. Amen. Thanks, man.
The We Are Vineyard podcast is a production from the team at Vineyard USA. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. Leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Connect with us online for additional resources. Our website is vineyardusa.org, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at VineyardUSA. Thanks for listening. See you next week.